This morning, the timeline for Canada's economic future didn't just shift, it accelerated. When US Ambassador Pete Hoekstra stood before the Toronto business establishment, on Thursday, June 11th, he didn't offer a suggestion. He issued a deadline, with the CUSMA review clock ticking down to the July 1st cutoff. Hoekstra's demand for the immediate cessation of Canadian retaliatory measures marks the end of diplomatic posturing and the beginning of a hard bargaining phase that threatens to dismantle the bedrock of Canada's export economy. To understand the way out of this moment, look at the architecture of the last 16 months. Since February 2025, the Canada-United States trade relationship has functioned under a regime of mutual friction. Canada implemented a 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of US goods, while provinces initiated targeted exclusions, pulling American products from shelves and shuttering contracts with US firms. These were not minor grievances. They were signals of a sovereign state attempting to claw back leverage in a lopsided partnership. Now, that leverage is being systematically tested. The sequencing here is deliberate. Hoekstra's intervention in Toronto occurred precisely 72 hours before Prime Minister Mark Carney is scheduled to walk into a room with Donald Trump at the G7 summit in France. This is not a coincidence of scheduling. It is a calculated effort to strip Canada of its negotiating room before the principals even meet. By framing Canadian retaliation as a violation of the CUSMA framework rather than a policy response, the US side is attempting to delegitimize Canada's defensive maneuvers, effectively demanding that Ottawa enter the room with its hands tied. The stakes are pinned to the 90% of Canadian exports that currently reside under the protection of the CUSMA agreement, a total valuation of approximately $1.3 trillion in annual TRA. Should the July 1st deadline pass without a definitive renewal, the transition into a cycle of annual reviews creates a permanent state of precariousness. It shifts the power dynamic from a stable, long-term commitment to a volatile, year-to-year negotiation. This is the structural objective: to ensure that Washington retains the ability to extract concessions in perpetuity by keeping the threat of withdrawal perpetually on the table. Observe the contrast between the official narrative and the tactical reality. In the public square, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc projects continuity, citing the deep integration of our economies and shared histories to bridge the widening gap. Behind the scenes, the US strategy remains unchanged and uncompromising. US Trade Representative Jameson Greer has explicitly stated that he does not anticipate a resolution by July 1st, while Ambassador Hoekstra has signalled that even a full withdrawal of Canadian retaliatory measures, the alcohol bans, the contract exclusions, will yield no immediate tariff relief from Washington. The message from the White House is stripped of all ambiguity. The current tariffs are a permanent feature of the new North American landscape. And Canadian compliance is not an opening to a deal, but a requirement for existence. We are witnessing a clear pivot in the Canadian executive branch. Professor Daniel Bailong has rightly identified the tension between Carney's earlier promises to oppose the erosion of the rules-based order and the current, muted approach his administration is adopting to survive the G7 meeting. The strategic reality is that the elbows are being forced down. When Lighthizer compares Canadian resistance to that of China, he is not describing a legal reality. He is providing a justification for escalation. By lumping Ottawa into the high-risk category, Washington is telegraphing its intent to treat Canadian sovereignty as a secondary concern to the demands of its own domestic industrial protectionism. This puts the Canadian government in a vice. The public, which supported the boycott of American goods throughout 2025, now watches as their leadership prepares to walk back those very measures under the glare of the G7 lights. The question isn't whether Carney can maintain the current pressure. The question is whether he has any remaining manoeuvrability left before the July 1st deadline. As the distance between the rhetoric of sovereignty and the reality of the G7 negotiations closes, the true cost of this trade dependency is coming into sharp focus. We are not just watching a trade negotiation. We are watching a fundamental recalibration of what it means for Canada to exist in the shadow of Fortress North America. But as Carney prepares to step onto the world stage in Evian-les-Bains, The most dangerous variable remains the volatile, unpredictable intent of the man on the other side of the table. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. What happens when the legal architecture of a trade deal clashes with the raw geopolitical ambitions of its primary signatory? To understand why the July 1st review date is being treated as a pivot point for Canadian sovereignty, we have to look past the headlines and into the specific. Mechanical traps built into the CUSMA framework itself. The deal was signed in 2020 with a 16-year lifespan, but it contains a deliberate sunset clause, in Article 34.7, that mandates a joint review on the 6th anniversary of its entry into force. This is not a routine checkup, it is a scheduled vulnerability. On July 1st, 2026, the three parties are required to formally state their intent to extend the agreement for another 16 years. If they fail to reach a unanimous consensus, the agreement does not simply expire. It enters a state of permanent, rolling instability. It triggers a requirement for annual joint reviews for the remainder of its term, ending in 2036. This annual review cycle is the trap that Washington is currently exploiting. By refusing to commit to a clean 16-year renewal, the US effectively transforms the trade relationship into a perpetual hostage negotiation. Every single year, Canada would be forced to return to the table, defend its policies, and likely offer fresh concessions just to keep the status quo of tariff-free access. The strategic architecture of this maneuver is composed of three distinct layers of pressure. First, there is the Fortress North America Containment Policy. This is the official framework promoted by provincial leaders like Doug Ford, ostensibly to align Canada with US security interests and shut out external competition, specifically China. However, in practice, it functions as a mechanism for American domestic protectionism. By framing the agreement through the lens of national security, the US administration can justify the imposition of sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and energy, while simultaneously demanding that Canada harmonise its investment screening, environmental standards, and procurement policies to mirror Washington's own. It turns the fortress into a one-way valve. American capital and goods move in, while Canadian policy autonomy is screened out. Second, the manipulation of the retaliation threshold. Ambassador Hoekstra's demand that Canada drop its retaliatory measures, the provincial liquor bans, the contract exclusions, the Starlink cancellation, is a move to de-escalate the conflict only on Canadian terms. By characterising these defensive actions as violations of the agreement, Washington is attempting to set a legal precedent that strips Canada of its right to proportional response under international trade norms. The strategic intent is to ensure that even as the US maintains its own prohibitive tariff walls, Canada is legally and diplomatically boxed into a position of non-interference. Third, the financial asymmetry of the negotiation. With $1.3 trillion in annual trade on the line, the cost of a no-deal scenario for Canada is existential. Over 75% of our exports are anchored to the US market. Washington, by contrast, views this trade volume not as a partnership, but as a lever. By withholding a formal commitment to the 16-year renewal, the White House creates a climate of systemic uncertainty that drives private investment out of Canada and into the US, where the trade environment is perceived as more stable under the protection of the fortress walls. This is the hidden cost of the current diplomatic dance. Every day of ambiguity leading up to July 1st is a day where the risk premium on doing business in Canada increases. Companies are already scaling back, waiting to see if the rules-based order survives the summer. Washington knows this. They are not waiting for us to make a better argument. They are waiting for our economic fatigue to turn into political capitulation. The urgency of the moment is not found in the summit rhetoric or the promise of beneficial talks between Carney and the Trump administration. It is found in the simple math of the July deadline. If the review is not finalised, the 2036 sunset date becomes a ticking clock of uncertainty, and the Fortress North America framework becomes the only shelter on offer. Canada is currently being asked to pay for its own security with the currency of its own policy sovereignty. And as the G7 summit approaches, we are about to see just how much of that currency the current government is willing to spend to keep the doors to the American market from closing entirely. The trap is set. As we have seen, the July 1st review is not merely a bureaucratic hurdle. It is a weaponized deadline designed to force Canada into a permanent state of precariousness. By linking the threat of CUSAMA's expiration to the demand for total, unilateral de-escalation, Washington has effectively stripped away the pretense of a rules-based order and replaced it with a transactional, power-based reality. The implications of this shift extend far beyond the immediate trade statistics. We are witnessing the final dissolution of the post-NAFTA era, an era defined by the illusion that continental trade was a shared, permanent benefit rather than a temporary concession. In the pre-Trump landscape, Canada-US, relations operated on the assumption of structural convergence. Today, that framework has been inverted. Under the Fortress North America doctrine, Canada is being relegated from a strategic partner to a subordinated tier of the American supply chain, expected to align its defense, energy, and procurement policies with Washington's domestic agenda while receiving zero long-term guarantees in return. This shift carries profound consequences for Canada's broader geopolitical orientation. Prime Minister Mark Carney's current diplomatic pivot toward European alliances, his integration into the EU's safe defence procurement mechanism, and his push for non-US export growth is not just a secondary policy choice. It is a desperate, existential pivot. It is an acknowledgement that the American umbrella, once assumed to be a shield, is now being used to apply pressure. Canada is effectively attempting to build a third path in a world of great power rivalry, trying to leverage its critical minerals, energy reserves, and technological assets to form a counterbalance that doesn't rely solely on the volatility of the Oval Office. Yet, the math remains unforgiving. When 75% of your exports are tethered to a market that no longer views your prosperity as a strategic necessity, every pivot to Europe or the Global South is a long-term play against an immediate, suffocating reality. We are watching a country grapple with the limits of middle power influence in an age where the hegemon has stopped caring about the rules it once wrote. As Carney heads into the G7 summit, the mask of diplomatic warmth is being discarded. The reality is that Canada is entering this final, 3-week sprint not with the strength of a sovereign partner, but with the posture of a nation defending its economic lifeblood. The next critical juncture is not the July 1st deadline itself, which may well pass into a zombie state of annual rolling reviews, but the moment when Ottawa must decide if it will continue to bend toward the fortress or finally commit to the radical diversification required to survive outside of it. The chessboard is set, the pieces are moving, and by the time the dust settles this July, we will know whether Canada's future is to be a cornerstone of a new continental order or a casualty of an old one. Make sure you're subscribed to keep tracking this as it unfolds. The next few weeks will define the next decade.